Hey there, it's Keith Hayden, the digital novelist, here talking novel writing, not just for pretty prose, but for business writing and beyond. If you want to find out more about this podcast or my work, my novels, how I'm writing, go to keithhayden.net and you'll find a bunch of resources there. I've got a lot of stuff over there. What I'm going to talk about today is pros and cons of serializing your novel. Just last night, I did something I'd never done before. I published the first chapter of my current novel project, a supernatural horror novel called Gates of Okinawa, on Wattpad for free. This is an experimental move, and I have serialized my novel before, but never in a place like Wattpad where people are there are readers that are hungry for new stories all the time. I published it right before I went to bed, and I woke up. Well, I sent an email to my email list, and then I woke up to 5 views on my Wattpad. Now, this might not seem like such a big deal, but when I think about the number of people, known people, that have read my previous novel and my other books, I can never tell. I don't know that number, but this was a great way to get some eyes on my work, and I'll talk about other pros as well when it comes to serializing. Now, if you're not familiar, serializing just means issuing out your novel or your story in chapters or episodes, whatever you want to call it, online on some online platform. So maybe one week you'll do chapter one, next week you'll do chapter two, and so on. And this is a different way to do a novel because, of course, novels tend to be long. And that tends to be one of the challenges when it comes to serializing your work. And I'll talk about that in a second. But first, I want to talk about the pros of, from what I've seen in serializing your your novel. And the first one I've already touched on briefly, and that's the increased exposure that you get from putting your work online. How hard is it to get people to convince people to read your novel, especially if it's long, if it's not a novella, it's an actual novel, and it's pretty hard. When people see my first novel, Serious and Limnic, it's nearly 500 pages. And the way we are nowadays, people want quick wins and they want something that's consumable. And a 500-page novel, depending on how fast you read, it might take you a minute. It might take you a few weeks. It might take you a few months. And I've found that most people are casual readers. They're not hardcore readers. So that means they're going to go through it even slower. They may read a page a night or something like that, or a chapter a week, or some kind of cadence to where it's very slow. And so, bottom line is, serialization delivers the novel to them when they're ready. And that's great, obviously, for just keeping people on track with the story and for just getting it read. The next pro is instant feedback, or at least you can get instant feedback depending on where you post. This is something that's really hard to get in book form. I'll go back to some of my other stories that I've written. It's very hard to get good, useful feedback from readers. We live in an era of online reviews where someone will run one star you because the box they received your novel in from Amazon was kicked in and dented or bleached by the sun or something like that. It has nothing to do with your novel. This happens a lot these days. And that, I'll tell you, that sucks because as a writer, you want real feedback. You want something that's going to help you make your story better, make your writing better, make it more appealing, help you grow as a writer. And that's hard to get in traditional book form. But when you serialize, typically nowadays you're going to serialize on some type of online platform. You might choose Substack. You can do basically do it anywhere you want where there's writing. So I've seen people serialize things on X, Twitter. It's totally possible there. It's shorter, of course, and you have longer threads, especially. I don't think I've seen a serialized complete novel on X Twitter, but I've seen like shorter forms, novellas, short stories. Surely I've seen those. But there's so many platforms that you just have to pick which one you want, and you can get creative with how you present your novel. The next pro is you get to write at your own pace. And I put this one down because when you commit to writing an entire novel, it can take a while. It might take a few months, it might take years, depending on what your schedule is. You work full time, you got a family, whatever your situation is, it's going to take a different amount of time. But with serialization, you could release one episode or one chapter a month. And as long as your readers know that that's your cadence, then they will show up one chapter a month. Hopefully. We hope they do. But it allows you to write your own pace because when you don't serialize, you you can still write at your own pace, but you're the only way to release it is to release it all at once. And with serialization, they're all there. And I'll talk more in depth since I did mention it. And I kind of had this thought. This wasn't in my notes, but how you can get creative with how you present your novel when it comes to serialization. A few months ago, earlier this year in 2024, I released my novella, the follow up to my novel Sinkhole, and I did a lot of extra media with that. I did songs, I did music videos, I did images for it, and it really made it come alive. It really became kind of this comic book like story. And yes, it wasn't a novel, but I serialized it on Substack, and as I would release different the different sections, there were parts in that one. I called them parts. As I released each part, I would make an accompanying image, and I would release that as well to make it more of a complete package. And that's the fun part about serializing. Most of these platforms these days, they're not just writing platforms. They do exist out there, but they're kind of rare. Most platforms allow you to, I know on Wattpad, for instance, you can put images, you can put videos if you want. I don't think you can do audio. And they always shit on audio. They never make room for audio, but I wish they did. But anyway, that's another pro. So now let's switch gears and talk about the cons of serialization because there are plenty that I've encountered over the last few years that I've done it. The first major con is that it's not your best work. And I saw this last night, right after I posted the first chapter of my novel. I immediately saw a typo. Um, and this was after I've rewritten this chapter now, this first chapter. I think this is the third rewrite I've done. And so, had I serialized and just thrown it up there on the first go, then it's not going to be my best work. And I think that's troublesome, because when people find you online, they're going to judge you by the first thing that they read from you. And if it's full of typos, it doesn't make sense, or you're a big problem with serialization is it's harder to connect the story because you kind of have to make it up as you go along. If you don't have a draft, if you haven't like furiously outlined or anything like that, you're just writing as you go, you're getting feedback and you're kind of adjusting along the way. This can be really problematic and lead to a really messy story to where if you want to package it up later from serialization, it's in my experience, it's harder to package up a serialized work. It would start out serialized than if it started out non-serialized and then you broke it up. So keep that in mind. The second con is it's just easy to get lost in the social media hype. It's easy to get caught up in the comments, the views, the stats, the analytics, all this bullshit that, trust me, I've gone down this rabbit hole many, many times before with so many platforms, and it doesn't matter. It really doesn't, especially unless you're trying to be an influencer or you really want to make social media like there is a game plan or a business plan, basically, where social media becomes very important. How many followers you have, how much retention. But I feel like that's the default game we get suckered into playing. I know I've been suckered into it many times on several different platforms: YouTube, Twitter, X, LinkedIn. I've played the game on many platforms, and this happens all the time. You get captured by the oohs and the ahs, and you see all these YouTubers, and they're doing all these things this way. But maybe that's not the way you want to do things. And if it is, then get to creating and get to to posting as many times as you can. But if it's I guess that if you want to be serious about writing a novel, then you can't spend your time creating YouTube videos or creating content. Hate the content word, but you just can't. You need to be writing your novel. That's the only way it gets done. So anyway, that's the other con with serialization. This stuff tends to especially after you start gaining some traction and momentum, you get lost in it. The next thing I wrote down is you might lose your voice, and I wrote in parentheses audience capture, and this is basically where your story gets so popular, you get so much feedback that eventually you're writing a completely different story than you set out to write, or that your idea is lost. And I haven't had this happen before because, frankly, none of my stories have been popular enough to have it happen, but I've seen it happen to other people. And it's a sad thing where you're just kind of riding this roller coaster and you don't even know why you got on the ride in the first place after a while. And then it's hard to get off because you've got so much popularity, then maybe, sponsorship deals and people start approaching you, and then you become known for that thing or that story, and then it just becomes a very hard skin to shed. And I don't know about you, but that's not what I want as a novelist. I want a good blend of the stories that I want to tell that are important to me, but that people want to read and that people want to consume. And that's hard to get because, trust me, I've been trying to find that balance for years. It's difficult. So keep that in mind. That's definitely another con. The last con that I wrote down is how will you make money? And this is one that I haven't completely solved for myself because, like it or not, when you serialize, you are giving away your work. You are working for free essentially in exchange for exposure, in exchange for feedback. You are giving away your work for free. And if you are serious about not just being a novelist but writing a novel, then the hope is that when you finish writing that novel, that people want to compensate for you for that work, for that months and years of effort that you put in. And we all won't become J.R.R. Martin or J.K. Rowling or James Patterson or Dan Brown. We're not all going to become famous novelists, but enough to make a living is what I want, and I'm sure that's what you want too. And so I won't go into, because I want to keep this short. I wanted to keep it under 15 minutes, but I won't go into the ways that you might need to adjust in order to compensate for when you're serializing. How can you actually still capture value, capture monetary value, but still serialize? This is something I'm still working on. And subscribe to this podcast if you want to hear the answer, or go to my website and subscribe to keithhayden.net. And if I figure something out, then you'll be the first to know. That's going to do it for this episode of The Digital Novelist. I hope you enjoyed it. Follow me on social media. Twitter is my main social media channel, but I'm also on YouTube. This video or this podcast will probably be on YouTube as well, but those are my two main ones these days. Follow me there. KeithHayden.net is where it's at. You can find links to all of my creative work, my books, my podcast, my music. You can find it there. And let me know, do you serialize your novel? Have you tried it? How did it work for you? What did you think? Let me know in a comment or shout out through Spotify or wherever you're listening to this podcast. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.